Hello, I'm David Tudor again, and this is the second in a series of short videos on different aspects of conflict, security, stability, and development. Last time we talked about what security was, and we identified 3 levels of that security. This time we're going to talk about what happens when security goes away. I'm going to focus particularly on what I called last time the tactical level, the level of everyday life, but I'm going to say a little bit about the other 2 levels as well. Now, I want to begin by making one very important distinction, which is between the absence of security and the absence of a security system. We tend to believe that the two are the same. We see, for example, the absence of a policeman, of a prison system, of courts and so forth, and we say there is no security. In fact, I want to distinguish in these talks between a security system, which is a very recent development, and the provision of security as a state. And that distinction will become a little bit clearer as we go. Now, to some extent, this distinction has been picked up by the literature. We talk now about formal and informal providers of security. But in fact, the distinction is much more complicated than that and has a long and deep history, which we'll go into very, very briefly as we go. I said we'd start at the tactical level, which is the level of everyday life. Am I secure at home? Am I secure when I leave my home to walk in the streets, and so forth? Now, the first thing to say is that for most of human history, indeed probably for the overwhelming majority of human history, and in most places today, this does not exist. It certainly doesn't exist and never did exist in the sense of a security sector. It's something of a shock when we look at early civilizations, civilizations that we admire for what they did in Greece and Rome, in Egypt and China and so forth. And we realize that these societies, had nothing that could be described as an organized security sector. Some of them had armies, some of them had judges and other royal or municipal officers and that kind of thing. But there was no police force in ancient Rome. Crimes happened all the time and nothing much happened in response to them. This state of affairs continued right up to the 18th century in Europe, when the first fumblings in the direction, for example, of prisons began to be seen. Until that point, the only way that criminals could be brought to justice was through a private prosecution, which meant you had to have the money. And the punishment of criminals for being found guilty was usually death, sometimes mutilation, sometimes transportation to a colony in what was effectively a form of slavery. It was only at the end of the 18th century that the first real prisons started to be used for criminals as opposed to political prisoners and debtors, interestingly enough. So it's not too much of an exaggeration to say that in those days there was law but no order. There was crime but no punishment, at least not in an organized sense. Now, you would expect, I think, given what I've just said, that the situation in most of these civilizations would be one of total anarchy. You would expect a Hobbesian state of war of all against all to be happening, together with our friends Nasty, Brutish and Short. But in fact, this is very often not the case. And the reason why it isn't the case goes back to the distinction that I made earlier between formal structures, between a security system, what we nowadays call a security sector, with different organizations, functions and laws, and the state of security. Now consider a relatively simple, relatively early community. There is no police force. There is no group within the community which is capable of ensuring that laws are followed. There are indeed no laws really in the modern sense of the term. What there are customs and traditions which people tend to obey. How do you enforce them? Well, let's look at what happens if you don't enforce them. In early societies, violence was fairly common, and crime was fairly common, and it was normal to try to deal with this kind of thing informally and through social mechanisms. Why? Well, if I get into a drunken quarrel and kill your brother, you might come and kill my brother, in which case I will feel morally obliged to go and kill your other brother, in which case you might come and kill my cousin, and eventually more and more people will become involved, and the whole system is likely to collapse. Now, people in those days were not stupid, and they realized that this sort of thing was perfectly possible if it was not controlled. So early societies, and quite a few that still exist today, developed highly sophisticated and highly capable mechanisms for resolving conflict. The purpose was not necessarily to punish the individual, the purpose was to stop the conflict spreading, because in a situation such as I've described, there was no logical point at which that conflict should end. It could go on until everyone in the village was dead. This is why the French anthropologist René Girard emphasized ritual as a way of diffusing conflict. And in his book on the subject, he talked about violence and the sacred, talked about the choice of the surrogate, the scapegoat, to be expelled from the group and take all their sins with them. The original meaning of the word outlaw in English is someone who is outside the law, who is not protected by the law, and can therefore be freely killed. And this person was often thrown out of the tribe, and then it was agreed that at that point everything that needed to be done was done. That person might also be ritually sacrificed in certain contexts. And it's interesting if you look at things like war crimes trials today, for example, to see the element of ritual sacrifice, which still remains. Now, if the basic problem is of preventing uncontrollable violence from destroying a society, you need highly sophisticated and quite complex rules which everyone has to obey. However, what's interesting about these codes is that in almost every case they weren't written down. They were what you grow up with, they're what you're socialized into accepting as a young person, and then upholding as you become an adult. What this meant was that when the first Westerners arrived in many of these societies and found no codes of written laws, they assumed that these societies were actually very simple and that violence must be a common and everyday affair. One of the ironies of this situation was that in most cases, the societies visited by these anthropologists were, and still are, more complex and sophisticated than most Western societies are. The first Westerners did not see things because they were not written down. And if you look at the work of James Scott, for example, on this subject, he shows quite convincingly how, in many cases, Westerners have simply failed to see what's in front of them, and that part of the process of state building in countries in the third world has been the replacement by a Western-style state of traditional ways of doing things, which are often in last analysis, better, because as far as the state is concerned, these ancient ways of doing things don't exist. They're not, in Scott's terms, leasable. They can't be seen or understood. Now, excuse me, I've just mentioned that many of these traditions were destroyed by the creation of modern states. And I think it's fair to say that liberal states, which are constructed along entirely different principles, are largely responsible for this. Liberal states have a couple of characteristics which are extremely important here. Firstly, they promote written law. In other words, rather than asking ourselves, what should we do, or what have we always done, or what are our traditions, or even what is sensible, we ask ourselves, what is written in this book? Early civilizations, like the Romans, for example, who had written laws, still distrusted laws whenever those laws appeared to them to contradict common sense, and frequently were guided more by the spirit than the letter. Modern liberal society and liberal systems of law, which arose first in the commercial context, where things need to be very precise, argue about the precise meanings of words, rather than what is the right thing to do. And this has usually a rather destructive effect on societies, because people no longer ask what is the right thing to do, they ask what can I get away with, which is a rather different question. Secondly, and particularly under the influence of monotheism, liberal societies very much identify individual criminal guilt. This guilt is both legal and moral. For many societies, the fact that somebody may have done something which set off a chain of events is relevant but not all determining. In the case of liberal states, we have a decontextualized, if I can use that word, a decontextualized sense of guilt, which has nothing to do with the background, which has nothing to do with history, nothing to do with the social context, but asks the question, did X carry out act Y? And in such a situation, which many early societies would think was hopelessly naive and unsophisticated, we make judgments on essentially technical grounds about acts committed by individuals. Now, I've said that the replacement of traditional ways of resolving conflict by modern liberal justice systems was probably inevitable. It's a process in part linked to the creation of the state. The problem is that in many parts of the world, such systems have supplemented but not replaced traditional ones. In some cases, they've supplemented and destroyed traditional ones. This typically happens when there's a large movement of people from the countryside to the town, for example. In the town, even more in the city, traditional linkages are broken, traditional patterns of social control are disrupted. But very frequently, the formal apparatus of the state, often grafted on very recently under Western pressure and according to Western examples, either cannot cope or breaks down at the first sign of conflict. So you have the paradox that, of course, it's always easier to destroy than to create. And it's very hard to recreate, if not impossible to recreate, the sense of social solidarity which controls crime and which prevents particularly violence getting out of control. As a result, what happens? Well, people tend to cluster into self-governing units and self-identifying units for protection. We've seen this in a number of conflicts. We've even seen it in Europe in the former Yugoslavia. You look around for people like you, whom you can cooperate with, whom you can work together with, who will trust you. And you put your trust in systems that you believe will help you. Now, one of the things that's most curious, but in a way also logical, is that very frequently the force that emerges to control to control crime and to control violence is organized crime itself, because organized crime has the characteristic of firstly being based more often than not on some kind of ethnic or other identity mechanism, so that you know who you can trust. And secondly, organized crime is organized, and it doesn't actually like crime unless it is committing that crime itself. So in such a situation, organized crime can be quite effective, not necessarily very ethical, but quite effective in controlling a situation, although it's obviously not a long-term solution. Now, very briefly, if the sort of situation I've described has happened, this is usually because security has broken down at higher levels. The operational level, remember, is the level of the community, anything less than the level of the state. It's the ability to move safely around the country, to move from place to place for goods to be transported, and so forth. And here there's a fundamental difference with the tactical level. For almost all of human history, there's been a distinction between us and them, between we as members of this group and them not as members of this group. Sometimes this was actually set down in law. If you look at the Old Testament, you will find quite quickly the commandment, thou shalt not kill, which is, of course, a commandment to be used internally among the Old Testament Jews. The parallel commandment in the book of Deuteronomy not only permits, it actually instructs the Jews to go and exterminate members of rival tribes. And this was entirely normal at the time. This was why, until the invention of the modern state, long-distance travel was difficult, long-distance commerce was very complicated. And basically, you treated everyone from outside your community, maybe even outside your village, as a potential enemy. There were, of course, ways of resolving conflict between groups, between villages, but fundamentally they didn't make the situation that much more stable. You don't get security at the operational level until you get the overarching state, which provides the strategic level of security. And when the strategic level breaks down in a conflict, the operational level breaks down as well, and this results in the disruption and often the end of security at the level of everyday life. At that point, past loyalties come back, identities which were previously suppressed or not thought very important suddenly come back and start being important again. And the question that people ask always at this point is a very simple one. Who will protect me? Who are my friends? Well, they're not Facebook friends, that's clear. And the people who will protect me are people who see themselves as having a common interest, and I having a common interest with them. Now, a situation where you have different groups who no longer trust the state to protect them and organize for their own defense is one of the ways in which conflicts start. It's not the only way in which conflicts start, but it is a fairly typical one, and it is something that we find very often in history and even today. So, in summary, security in everyday life requires security at the operational and strategic levels first. Strategic security is a delicate thing. If it breaks down, operational security tends to break down, and at that point, security in everyday life has broken down as well. Now, we'll be talking in the next session about all this, again, in the context of the causes of conflict, and we'll look to see how this can be linked with other reasons why conflict might start. Thank you very much. Goodbye.